Good evening, folks. This is Diamond from the Oppenheimer Ranch Project on Thursday, October 26th at 9:38 p.m. Mountain Time, 2017. Giving you a little Ice Age paleogeographic update. We're going to be talking about the Little Ice Age, the Maunder Minimum, the paleogeographic reconstructions of the last Ice Age, the effects of the Little Ice Age on society, and give you some heads up on where you should be moving as we descend into the grand solar minimum. First, let's do a quick lesson on the effects of cosmic ray flux and temperature on Earth. What you're looking at is the last 1,000 years in North America. The Little Ice Age affected North America more than the rest of the globe. We're going to learn that as we get into the video. But what I want you to pick up right off the bat here, you can see the medieval warm here corresponding to high C14 and low galactic cosmic rays. As galactic cosmic ray flux increases, the temperature on Earth in North America drops drastically. And this bump in temperature here is these reductions in galactic cosmic rays causing the temperature to rebound. But when it dropped back off, the temperature dropped back down and followed it. So there's a direct correlation here we can see from the most recent ice core and proxy data, multi-proxy data, Greenland boreholes, worldwide boreholes, tree rings, pollen, shells, stalagmites, etc., that there's a direct correlation between temperature and galactic cosmic rays. Look at this peak, directly related. So working on those parameters, let's get into the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age is a period occurring from the 14th century through the mid-19th century when mountain glaciers expanded at several locations: the European Alps, New Zealand, and Alaska, and the Southern Andes. And mean annual temperatures across Northern Hemisphere declined by 0.6 C or 1.1 Fahrenheit relative to the average temperature between 1000 and the present. The term Little Ice Age was introduced to the scientific literature by Dutch-born American geologist F.E. Matthes in 1939. Originally, the phrase was used to refer to Earth's most recent 4,000-year period of mountain glacier expansion and retreat. However, it's not even used for 1500 to 1850 anymore. It's typically used from 1300 to 1850 because of the proxy data, which I showed you, which we'll look at again here in some temperature data, where you can see that the Little Ice Age is occurring here between around 1400 to around 1900, according to the temperature data in the Northern Hemisphere. So what we're going to find out is that the Little Ice Age affected different places on the globe in different ways and at different times, which is interesting because it was not very helpful for us moving into the grand solar minimum, except that we can use the total data to make our best guess on where we should be. So this goes into the geographic extent. I'll leave you the Wikipedia on the Little Ice Age. It talks about areas involved in dating, and then it has the effects. So let's go over Europe, because the Northern Hemisphere had the most effects from the Little Ice Age. However, I think that's just because of lack of data in the Southern Hemisphere. But let's get on with the video. In Europe, the Little Ice Age brought colder winters to parts of Europe and North America. Farms and villages in the Swiss Alps were destroyed by encroaching glaciers in the 17th century. Canals and rivers in Great Britain and the Netherlands were frequently frozen deep enough to support ice skating and winter festivals. The first River Thames Frost Fair was in 1607 and the last in 1814. Changes to the bridges and the addition of the Thames embankment affected the river flow and depth, greatly diminishing the possibility of further freezes. You can read about more of Europe. Sea ice surrounding Iceland extended for miles in every direction, closing harbors and shipping. The violin maker Antonio Stradivari produces instruments during the Little Ice Age. This is because of the cold weather and the tight growth of the spruce trees, why his instruments have such amazing flavor. There's lots of depictions of what occurred in the Little Ice Age in European paintings. I even have a video on this that's all paintings, including the hunter in the snow, winter landscape with ice skaters. Early European explorers and settlers of North America reported exceptionally severe winters. For example, according to Lamb, Samuel Chapman reported bearing ice along the shores of Lake Superior in June of 1608. Ice in June of 1608. Both Europeans and indigenous people suffered excess mortality in Maine during the winter of 1607 and 1608, and extreme frost was reported in Jamestown, Virginia. So you can read about Mesoamerica and Asia as well. Now, the History Channel has a nice piece here called Little Ice Age Big Consequences, and we'll go over some of the consequences of the Little Ice Age. Another one of those ice paintings. This is Merrymakers skate on the frozen River Thames in 1677. Look how merry they're making it. Now, between the early 14th and 19th centuries, a period of cooling known as the Little Ice Age chilled the planet, and there were consequences, including the Great Famine, beginning in the spring of 1315, the Black Death, typically considered an outbreak of bubonic plague in the mid-14th century, the Manchu conquest of China. In the first half of the 17th century, famines and flood caused by unusually cold, dry weather enfeebled China's ruling Ming dynasty. Unable to pay their taxes, peasants rose up in revolt, and by 1644 had overthrown the imperial authorities. Witch hunts. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII, Pope Innocent, oh my God, recognized the existence of witches and echoed popular sentiment by blaming them for the cold temperatures and resulting misfortunes plaguing Europe. The 30 Years' War, among other military conflicts, the brutal 30 Years' War between Protestants and Catholics across Central Europe has been linked to the Little Ice Age. The rise of the potato. When Spanish conquistadors first introduced the potato in the late 16th century, Europeans scoffed at the unfamiliar starch. In the mid-1700s, however, some countries began promoting the hardy tuber as an alternative to crops indigenous to the region, which often failed to withstand the Little Ice Age's colder season. It soon caught on with farmers throughout Europe, particularly in Ireland, probably saving millions. The French Revolution. As the 18th century drew to a close, 2 decades of poor cereal harvests, drought, cattle disease, and skyrocketing bread prices had kindled unrest among peasants and the urban poor in France. Hence the French Revolution. The writing of Frankenstein in 1816, dust from volcanic eruptions, and the general chill of the Little Ice Age resulted in the famously frosty Year Without a Summer across the Northern Hemisphere. Like many Europeans, teenage runaway Mary Shelley kept warm by huddling around a fire with her friends. One of them, the poet Lord Byron, encouraged his companions to write and share their own supernatural tales. Mary's was published 2 years later as Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. The invention of the bicycle. There's a lot of time on your hands when it's freezing out, folks. And the Midwestern population explosion. On the other side of the Atlantic, the Year Without a Summer convinced many New England residents to relocate. Horrified by escalating grain prices and June snowfalls, they settled in the Midwestern United States, providing a boost to the expansion movement that had begun 2 decades earlier and beginning what would be the end of soil in the Midwest. This paper by Michael Mann, of all people, called The Little Ice Age, The Earth System's Physical and Chemical Dimensions of Global Environmental Change, will interest many of you. It is a scientific expose on what happened. Here is a picture depicting the Argentière Glacier in the French Alps from an etching made between 1850 and 1860. This is 1850. This is today. So you can see what 150 years can do. It can make it appear as if this climate is warm and hospitable, but just in a short period of time, it can be glacial and hellacious, where 100-meter high walls of ice encroach on homes and cities. Come down to the graph here. And what you're going to find is estimated relative temperature variations during the past millennium for different regions. Now, I showed you the galactic cosmic ray and the temperature proxy data. This really doesn't delineate temperature proxies. They all seem quite similar. However, if you come to this paper, it shows definitive differences in the climatic shifts related to the cosmic ray flux on the planet. Now, there was a peak in 1620 of sunspots, which is showing up in a few places. But what you can see is that the worst hit areas because of this grand solar minimum were central England, the entire Northern Hemisphere in general, Western North America, subtropical North Atlantic, and the tropical Andes. Fennoscandia was crippled in 1600, and we'll go there. But Eastern China was the most moderate. So Eastern China is looking like the safest place to be, except for its seismic activity and the potential for tsunami. So maybe Eastern China highlands. Now, despite the difficulties in marginal regions, culture and economy were generally flowering in Europe during the Little Ice Age. So, folks, this is not Armageddon. The problem is that there are billions of people who don't even know about what's happening with the climate, and they're not going to be prepared because this sets on very quickly. And if global unrest and famine set on in 3 years, no one is going to have time to understand what permaculture is, how to build a geothermal greenhouse, how to wild harvest foods. And therein lies the issue. Which is why friends like the Ice Age Farmer and I get along very well, because we are both every day working towards new steps in resiliency and sustainability in our future. And if the grid were to shut down and I were to be locked here in my ranch, I would survive right now. Not as nice as I would like to. I still have several more years until I'll be totally prepared. But I'm ready. The problem is that 99.9% of you are not ready. So today's the day to start getting ready, folks. Because the hope is there. Despite the difficulties in marginal regions, culture and economy were generally flowering. Think about what I said about Stradivarius's violins. This is most visible in the way that people transformed their environment during the 17th and 18th centuries with expanding agriculture and large-scale land reclamation. So what they did was they used permaculture principles. Permacultures are based on the marginal regions. And if you don't go with the flow and move with the punches, you're going to fail. So they changed. And if you watched Adapt 30 the last few days, he keeps talking about these fruit walls. That was part of the transformation during the 17th and 18th centuries with expanding agriculture and large-scale land reclamation. Everyone's home had its own garden permaculture farm in the Netherlands and England, which is why it's still an agrarian society today, most of Europe. North America, unfortunately, not the same. The Little Ice Age also coincided with the maritime expansion of Europe and the creation of seaborne trading and later colonial empires, because there had to be new trade routes because the old routes were cut off. And if you get deeper into what these 5 papers say, what you're going to find is that it didn't get cold per se, but the temperature fluctuated, and it fluctuated seasonally up and down. So it gets hotter than usual as well as colder than usual in the strangest times. It's not a standard ice age, so to speak, a grand solar minimum, but it's a chaotic climatic time with torrential rains and flooding as well as drought. So let's quickly get into paleogeographic reconstructions before this video gets too long. This is what it looked like around 18,000 years ago at the peak of the last glaciation. And you can see the Northern Hemisphere is the most affected. There was some glaciation along the Andes, but mostly North America, the Northern Hemisphere. So the North American ice sheet during the Wisconsinian 18,000 years ago was massive, and then this caused the epic flood, the biblical flood in all the narratives around the globe, when a huge cosmic event caused melting of the majority of this sheet, and it outwashed out here on the western shores of North America, causing massive flood features in this entire region, as well as inland seas and lakes, some which exist today, like the Great Salt Lake, as remnants of a time when the sea connected to the flood. So I wouldn't live anywhere in the zone of this ice sheet. That's a heads up. Here's a better picture. The most affected part of North America is the Northeast. In fact, the West Coast modulates temperature, and sometimes Alaska becomes completely ice-free, as in this picture. This is approximately 16,000 years ago, and you can see the massive inland seas at that time. So heads up here, I wouldn't live anywhere in this region in the Northeast. I would be moving at least 500 miles south of the extent. Because even though the glaciers won't build in a few decades to this extent, the temperature variations in this area will be there, and the glaciers will be somewhere up in this area, and it will be driving the weather, which will be freezing and not what you're used to. Let's move over to Europe and Asia. Where over here is the Mediterranean, Europe. This is kind of a weird setup. Scandinavia is here. This is an entire ice sheet at 20 kiloyears, 20,000 years ago. So those of you in Scandinavia are not in a good place. And again, we'll go to 9,000 BC. I found this, a Russian source. It's an excellent map. Russian scientists have been doing excellent work, and I don't know why we haven't been using more of their data. So this is what it looked like just 11,000 years ago. Now sea levels had already risen 400 feet at this point. And one more picture here in a better, you can see the giant ice sheet here, the Celtic ice sheet covering all of Ireland. This is all of Scandinavia under an ice sheet, Svalbard, all of Greenland. This is 18,000 years ago, folks. There's substantial evidence that the Baltic Sea froze over, as did many rivers and lakes in Europe. Pack ice expanded as far south into the Atlantic, making shipping to Iceland and Greenland impossible for months on end. Winters were bitterly cold and summers were often cool and wet. These conditions led to widespread crop failure, famine, and population decline. The tree line and snow line dropped. Glaciers advanced, overrunning towns and farms in the process. There were increased levels of social unrest as large portions of the population were reduced to starvation and poverty. During the height of the Little Ice Age, it was in general about 1 degree Celsius colder than present. That is it, folks. It's almost impossible to detect. However, the prices of grain increased and wine became difficult to produce in many areas. This is happening now. If you do not see the signs, you're not looking. This is the historical information that we're supposed to be reading and saying, hey, this is what's happening now. The prices of grain are increasing because they're failing, and wine is becoming difficult to produce in many areas. Commercial vineyards are going to vanish in England. Fishing in Northern Europe was also badly affected as cod migrated south to find warmer water. Storminess and flooding increased in mountainous regions. Tree line and snow line dropped. In addition, glaciers advanced in the Alps in Northern Europe. Here's another picture of the Rhone Glacier, its furthest extent almost crushing this hotel in 1870. Iceland was one of the hardest hit areas. Sea ice, which today is far to the north, came down around Iceland. In some years, it was difficult to bring a ship ashore anywhere along the coast. Grain became impossible to grow, and even hay crops failed. Volcanic eruptions made life even harder. Iceland lost half of its population just 500 years ago. Tax records in Scandinavia show how many farms were destroyed by advancing ice of glaciers and by meltwater streams. Travelers in Scotland reported permanent snow cover over the Carrigmorn Mountains of Scotland at an altitude of 1,200 meters. That's less than 5,000 feet. In the Alps, the glaciers advance and threaten to bulldoze towns. Ice dam lakes burst periodically, destroying hundreds of buildings and killing many people. This is going to be killing tens of thousands of people in just a few decades. As late as 1930, the French government commissioned a report to investigate the threat of glaciers. They could not have foreseen that human-induced global warming was to deal more effective with this problem than any committee ever could. And therein lies the ruse. That there is a committee willing to sacrifice the lives of millions. Despite the difficulties in marginal regions, culture and economy were generally flowering in Europe. We talked about this. It's not all gloom and doom, but no one is prepared. Those that do survive we will be blessed with art and architecture flourishing. Now, guys, all the evidence is that the modern maximum is over. We're heading into a time of global cooling. These are the Paleogeographic reconstructions, and this is the best data I can get you on what actually happened. So this is what happens when cosmic ray flux increases and the temperature drops. And these are the results. The fall of China, witch hunts, 30 years war, Black Death, Great Famine. Be safe.